So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Climate Adaptation Research for BC Agriculture Workshop. This session is Innovation to Adapt Vegetable Production to a Changing Climate. My name is Serena Black, and I'm the Agriculture Extension Specialist from the University of Northern BC, and I'm also the chair of the BC Agriculture Climate Adaptation Research Network. So very excited to be here on day 2 of our 3-day virtual workshop. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kwantlen Polytechnic. We have people joining in with us today from many places, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands. This session is in part of the annual workshop hosted by the BC Agriculture Climate Adaptation Research Network, or ACARN for short, as I've mentioned. ACARN is a provincial network that was launched in 2017 to improve linkages and collaboration to more effectively address climate adaptation research and extension needs in the BC agriculture sector. This workshop is a chance for us to share knowledge on research and tools that are available to support agricultural climate change adaptation. And it's also an opportunity for questions, discussions, and networking. So before we get into the session, I'll do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for everybody. We do want to learn a little bit more about who we have joining us today. So I'm going to launch a poll. This will also help our presenters get an idea of who's participating. So yeah, you'll see that popped up on your screen. If you could take a moment and fill that in, that would be great. Yeah, and as we take a moment for everybody to fill that in, I'll note that our session here today includes 3 presenters, and we will have a short Q&A break after each presenter. To use questions, please use the Q&A box instead of the chat. So you'll find the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control. So you can enter questions as you think of them, and it's easier for us to keep track than if you put them in the chat box. You'll also note that there's a thumbs up symbol in the Q&A, and so you can upvote other people's questions by clicking on that symbol. So it looks like we have our results for who is participating today. Looks like the majority, 36%, is government, followed by industry associations and producers. Look at that, 20% producers. So fantastic that everybody is joining us here today, along with a lot of research scientists and a fair number of students as well. So welcome everybody. The last piece of Zoom etiquette that I'll mention is that is for all of us to acknowledge that we're working under new work from home conditions. So please bear with us and our speakers if we have any unexpected distractions or interruptions that come up. So without any further ado, let's get started. It is my pleasure to begin the session with Dr. Renee Prasad, who's an associate professor at the University of Fraser Valley in the Agriculture Technology Department. Renee does on-farm field research focusing on pest management and variety development. And today she is going to be sharing her work on okra, Asian eggplants, sweet potatoes, and bitter melon. So welcome, Renee.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okie doke. So I'm assuming you can see my slides now. Yes? Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So I'm actually only going to talk about sweet potato because to try to talk about all those crops will take too long. So as was mentioned, I work in field vegetable crops, and I've been working in field vegetables since 1996. And most of that work has been in the pest management side of things. But if you are in something for 24 years, you start to notice a few things. And one of them is the decline in the diversity of the types of field vegetables that are being grown in the Fraser Valley. And there's a lot of reasons for this decline, and we won't really go into them right now. But it's still something that concerns me because I think there's a lot of value in having diverse field vegetable production. So diversity in terms of lots of different types of crops. And this picture here in the slide just shows you kind of, you know, the situation where we don't want to get into, where, you know, basically we have two crops, corn and soybeans, something we just want to kind of avoid. So what are some of the reasons why we want to keep our field vegetable sector diverse? Well, one of them is because of crop rotation. Having lots of different vegetable crops to choose from is very helpful for vegetable growers because it allows them to make good choices in terms of rotation. And crop rotation is sort of that fundamental tool in the IPM toolbox for managing soil-borne pests. The other reason, though, why we want to have diversity in field vegetable production is so that growers are in a good place to take advantage of market opportunities. So the graph or the table that I'm showing you here is from Agriculture Canada, and it's some of those you know, industry statistics that I think people don't spend enough time on because I actually enjoy looking at these a lot. So this table is divided into 5 columns, 2012 to 2016, and they've just ranked about 20 different field crops based on the value of the import. So these are field vegetable crops that are imported into Canada. So when I looked at this, there's a few things that stuck out. One is that we import a lot of things that we can grow, and we know we can grow. And I became somewhat fascinated in the bottom part of the table because there's a few things there that I didn't know whether we could grow, like sweet potatoes, field eggplants, and okra. So when you do some of that research to find out, can we grow this? I found these folks at the Vineland Research and Innovation Center in Ontario. And just as I was starting to ask these questions, they were finishing their field work on answering the same types of questions. So it was really good timing to be able to collaborate with the folks at Vineland on their work on looking at eggplant and okra production in the field. And most interestingly, in 2018, they had a new sweet potato variety that they bred for production in Canada. So the big picture questions that we were asking in this project was, can we meet the demand for more diverse vegetable crops with local supply? And as was introduced, you know, there's a lot of different crops we worked on, but for this presentation, I'm going to focus on sweet potatoes. And my part of this research was to answer this question of, can we grow the crop locally? My collaborator, Dr. Lisa Powell, who is now at Sweetbriar College, she was looking more at the marketing end of things. And so I will mention that briefly as well. So here's a picture of our field plots. This is out in the Sumas Prairie area of Abbotsford. As I mentioned, we were collaborating with the Vineland Research and Innovation Center, and we were looking at growing Radiance. This is a sweet potato variety bred for the shorter Canadian growing season. As you can see in this picture, the grower we were collaborating with, both the growers we collaborated with in 2018, used black plastic in slightly raised beds to grow a lot of their crops. So cucurbits, field peppers are grown almost exclusively in this sort of setup. So the question for 2018 was, do we need to grow sweet potatoes, in particular Radiance, in black plastic, or can we go bare ground, as you see in the foreground of this picture? If you haven't seen what sweet potatoes look like when they're growing the field, this is just a snapshot. Hopefully you get some nice healthy green slips, and they will look like this when you transplant them. Shortly thereafter, they look really bad. So even almost a month after planting, they will look quite bad, and you just have to kind of accept that that's normal. This is what our plots look like just prior to harvest, and you can see that they filled in well, they grew really well. There's a bit of russeting going on, and that's because of spider mites, which is to be expected. So this slide is showing you our 2018 results, and I'll just talk you through what you're seeing here. The y-axis has the number of kilograms we've harvested per plot. The x-axis has our two treatments, so slips planted into bare ground plots or no plastic, and slips planted into plots that were covered with black plastic. The top graph is our conventional site, and the bottom graph is our organic site. The red line, I just want to take a minute to explain that. The red line is our benchmark for production in Ontario. So based on the feedback from the folks in Ontario, where they worked with growers who were producing sweet potatoes commercially in Ontario, a production of 3 kilograms of sweet potatoes per meter square is a really good production. That's sort of their benchmark for good yields. So we use that in our research as well. So we've just adjusted the 3 kilograms per meter square to work with our plots, which are 6 meters square. So what you can see in the top graph is that planting sweet potatoes into black plastic covered rows really resulted in significant improvements in yield compared to planting those slips into bare ground. However, in our organic site, we did not see any difference between no plastic or bare ground and plastic planting. So the reason for this is most likely because the quality of the plastic in the two sites was really very different. I'm not sure if that was due to the organic growers being limited in the type of plastic they could use, or it just happened that there were two different qualities of plastic. But in the conventional site, our black plastic had a lot of integrity. It lasted through the season till harvest. There weren't a lot of holes. In contrast, in the organic site, the black plastic was really starting to fall apart, midway through the season. So it wasn't really having that function of holding in the heat the way we wanted. In both 2019 and 2020, we wanted to follow up on the question of the plastic, but also to incorporate another element to the sort of the agronomic practices of growing sweet potatoes. And this is something the folks in Vineland had not worked on, but we did find a paper from 1998 where the researchers were looking at sweet potato production in the northern US and asking the question of how can we grow sweet potatoes in the northern US. In this study, Brown et al., the varieties they were using were Beauregard and Covington, which are very traditional sweet potato varieties that a lot of growers have played with in BC as well as elsewhere. And those are the varieties that are often grown in Texas and South Carolina and Florida. In the Brown et al. Study, they coupled planting sweet potatoes into black plastic along with using a row cover over top of the planting for the first 4 weeks of growth. So we wanted to replicate that and see what that would do to our yields. So this is a picture, a close-up of what one of our plots look like. And then in the background, you can see a plot that didn't have any cover on it. And again, we were working with Radiance, which is the variety provided by Vineland. So these are the results from 2020. We also have results from 2019, but they're a bit more messy and complicated to go through. So I focus on 2020 because it's nice and clean. So here we have, again, yield in kilograms per plot on the y-axis. We have two harvest dates, one at 110 days and one at 120 days. The blue bar are our covered plots and the orange bars are our uncovered plots. We covered the plots with our floating row cover for approximately 4 weeks after planting. And you can see here that we have no difference in yield between the uncovered and covered plots, regardless of whether we were doing harvest 1 or harvest 2. We think that the most likely explanation for this and why our results differ from the Brown et al. Study is because our variety Radiance is bred for that shorter Canadian growing season. So this idea of having two different ways to increase temperature so that transplants can get established and get growing quickly, it might not be necessary. This data I'm showing you is from our organic site. So again, the integrity of the plastic wasn't very strong. So I think what we want to do for our fourth field season in 2021 is continue to look at this question of how do we help those sweet potatoes establish in the early part of the season? And because so many of our growers that we work with are wanting to know if we can move away from plastic, we're going to look at growing without plastic, but using the row cover instead as a tool to increase the heat. And there's other tools that growers have talked about using as well. For example, using low tunnels as another strategy. One of the nice things working at the Vineland station is we were able to really get some help in understanding production issues. So for example, in this picture, you can see I've got these long skinny roots as well as some nice looking sweet potatoes. And those long skinny roots are tied to not having enough water and soil moisture within those early days, early weeks after transplanting, the slips. So you want to make sure sweet potatoes have good moisture. There's lots of other things we've learned that I'm sorry I don't have time to talk about right now, but soil compaction, weed control are huge issues for sweet potatoes. And in January at the Pacific Ag Show, I'll share. And then there's some challenges with getting radiant slips. The supply is not really well worked out. So we want to sort of maybe look at some of our work, but with more easily available varieties like Covington and Beauregard, just so growers understand how to grow those well. So just the last few slides here. Obviously, if a grower can't sell it, then they shouldn't produce it. So the question becomes, can growers sell it? And this was Lisa's part of the project. And the answer is yes. This is Sean and Michelle. They have taken over the direct farm side of the Wisby Veggie Farm in the Sumas Prairie. And their farm stand customers love and are very supportive of having those locally grown sweet potatoes for Canadian Thanksgiving. Growers could have locally grown sweet potatoes for Christmas as well, but they would have to make sure that they cure the sweet potatoes prior to and store them properly. The Wisbys are also BC Fresh growers. And so from BC Fresh's point of view, they do feel that sweet potatoes can be marketed. However, the challenge is to find a grower who would be able to work in sweet potatoes into their existing production plan. So being able to harvest them and cure them while also having to harvest potatoes or beets or cabbage at the same time. So this might be actually an opportunity for a new grower to enter the field vegetable market. So this is my last slide, and I just want to share sort of some take-home messages. This work was not done with climate adaptation and mitigation in mind. However, I feel that it's important to realize that being able to produce more field vegetables locally, like so more acres of what we already do, and then more diversity is going to be an important step in that mitigation aspect of responding to climate change. Also, we want to be able to reduce food waste. And so when a store like Loblaws brings in things like okra and eggplants from Mexico, Honduras, and California, a lot of that product that they bring in ends up being wasted quite quickly because of the low shelf life. So they're supportive of diversifying the veggie crops grown locally because they feel it will help them reduce food waste. Again, that's another mitigation strategy. And as I mentioned in the beginning, having more diversity in veggie crops that can be grown profitably can help growers have better crop rotations to break their soil disease cycles. And the last thing I just wanted to say, and I know there's some students out there, I feel like I wanted to share this picture with you. This is from one of those small little grocery stores in Surrey that caters to the South Asian market. And this picture here, I hope you can see my cursor going around. It says chorea bhaji. That's red root pigweed. And it's being imported from Fiji. So there's a lot of market potential for a lot of different veggie crops that, meet the needs of the very diverse population we have in the Fraser Valley. And the message for the students is that this picture from the grocery store is actually what inspired me to like sort of pursue this work. So don't be afraid to get inspiration somewhere other than the peer-reviewed literature. It's okay. And I think that's it. And so I just want to acknowledge all the funding agencies and collaborators, especially Susan Smith, who's with me always in the field. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thank you, Renee. As a grower, I myself use upcycled silage plastic. It's the only way to get squash to mature up here in the north. So love to see the work that you are doing. We'll take two questions really quick. So our top voted question is from Dieter. He said that, was there a big difference in soil color? The organic site may have had a higher soil temperature. So maybe a question on the how comparable the two different soils were.
Yep. So the two sites, the organic and conventional sites, were both in the Sumas Prairie, both on Tolmie Road, which I know Dieter knows, and they were literally 1 kilometer apart. So I felt like they shouldn't have been very different, but yet when we looked at the soil in terms of soil texture, there was definitely a difference. Like the organic site just had a heavier soil compared to the conventional site, which was, more of that sandy sumac soil that we sort of expect, if you know it.
Fantastic. And kind of while we're on that comparison site, since a lot of the work you were doing was comparing to the Vineland Research Center, what was the climatic difference between your research sites and the sites that they were using back in Ontario?
Yes, so that's a good question. So the main difference is that at least in the years when I was doing my field work and the folks in Vineland were doing their work, they don't have this thing called January in Vineland the way we do in the Fraser Valley. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, be thankful. But if you do, it's basically that we have, a nice May. We might even have a really nice April, and everyone's excited that it's going to be an early spring, it's going to be a hot summer. And then June, we're all back in our like sweaters and toques because it's really cold. And that happened pretty much every year. And I remember being a scout and having to wear a toque in the end of May, beginning of June. So it's a real thing that happens. And so that's the challenge for any of these crops, is you want to get them in the ground sort of in late May, but while they're still very young or in those early stages, they get hit with January. And so using some sort of extension technique like a row cover or low tunnel, I think is kind of really important.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Renee. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we can continue to type and interact, and there's lots of opportunities to interact in other capacities. But yes, I do want to thank you, Renee, for sharing that research, and we have lots of engagement happening around it, so it's obviously hitting home, so thank you. So let's continue with our next presentation. So we have Leah Sandler, who is the Organic Agriculture Research Associate at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Her research experiences spans from commodity grains to hemp to small-scale vegetable farming. So today she is going to be sharing some of the research she's doing on integrating hogs in a cover crop vegetable rotation for healthy soils. So welcome, Leah.
Thank you, Serena. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Such like that. Okay, dokie, and I'm gonna go into presenter mode.
Looks great.
Perfect. Okay, everyone, looks great. Okay, so good morning.
Leah, it swapped on you, so we're looking at.
What?
Right? Oh no, it's right. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I prefer it's the right way. Okay, good morning. Thanks for joining again. Like Serena said, Leah Sandler, and I work at the Institute for Sustainable Farming Systems, housed at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And at the Institute, we work on regional food systems, from agriculture, food, environment, economics, trying to build basically sustainable communities. And so I work on the agricultural side of things in terms of field level research and production. So today I'm going to talk to you about research that we've been doing now for 2 years that's looking at integrating hogs into a vegetable production system. And so really quickly, I'm going to just, whoa, that's not what we want. We want the outline. Just going to talk a little bit about conception and the objectives of this research, how we are doing it in terms of materials and methods, and then some preliminary results. So basically, the idea was that when it originated, was that many market crop farmers will routinely put some of their acreage into cover crops that follows a crop rotation system that allows them to rest the land. So that, you know, when we have intensive vegetable production, it's kind of hard on the ground. Put in some cover crops, we're rotating through. And depending on how farmers are, what their structure is, they can do this up to 3 times a year. So they can plant, grow, and then turn in that cover crop up to 3 times a season, spring, summer, and fall, for, you know, the usual cover crop benefits: added soil organic matter, fertility, controlling weeds, maybe breaking pest cycles. However, the practice of tilling cover crops in to terminate their growth or to reincorporate that material into the soil can really negatively impact soil structure and activity, as we, you know, there's reams of literature that can talk about, you know, potential negative side effects from tillage. And so in addition, specifically to where we are in Delta, in the Fraser Valley, these effects of tillage can really be exacerbated. We have some heavy clay soils, and so tillage can exacerbate those issues. And then, you know, if we're looking at small scale farmers or even new entry farmers, startups, they might not have access to the machinery and implements necessary to do large scale tillage. And so we have a couple research objectives. So the first was basically, how do we find a more regenerative way to manage these cover crops that farmers, because cover crops in themselves are a great idea, but, you know, instead of just tilling them back in every season or a couple times a season, how do we manage cover crops for fertility while reducing that tillage? And then to determine the potential benefits from, so we stuck on this idea of integrating hogs into these vegetable production. And Shauna had said there's been a lot of questions about livestock integration into systems. So I'm very excited about this, that this is striking, it sounds like, some interest. And hopefully we, you know, there's much more of this to come. So basically, okay, we're gonna look at how does integrating hogs into vegetable production affect things, in particular using strip grazing in a vegetable cover crop rotation, and looking at soil quality, nutrients, and then subsequent vegetable yield, so that we're looking at the whole system. So to do that, we used a randomized complete block design. And we had 4 replications of 2 treatments: grazing versus tillage. And these strips were 30 feet by 230 feet, so long strips. And then particularly in the grazing strips, they're subdivided into subplots of six plots within that strip. And so what I've done is I've created a little diagram so it's a little bit easier to understand. So hopefully you can see my cursor here. We have the 4 replications in terms of blocks, and then randomized within that is grazing versus tillage. The grazing is in the yellow and the tillage is in the white. And then, as you can see, they are divided into 6 subplots. And this is important for the grazing perspective, not so important for tillage, but as we're moving living animals in a, you know, intensive rotational grazing, we can't just have them grazing the whole area, particularly because it's not going to get at what we're trying to look at in terms of rotating cover crops in. And so we would put the pigs into the first subplot, and then move them as they go. So I'll tell you about that. So pigs were moved in through the subplots 1 through 6, or by whatever the subplot numbers were. using conservation tillage principle of at least 30% cover on the ground. Although as farmers, we're out there with them daily, we're looking at how much they're eating that cover crop down. And basically once that cover crop is eaten down, we're moving them to the next subplot. So they're moved through those series of 6 subplots twice throughout the season. And that equates to about every 7 days, about once a week. Although it was a longer, almost 15 days in the first cover crop. And that's what I want to talk about now. So the way we set it up is we did 3 cover crops. So we do a spring, a summer, and a fall. In May 15th, planted our spring cover crop across the whole field, oats, clover, and field pea. And then subsequent cover crops were the summer was a sudex grass, buckwheat, clover, and then finally a third one, the fall, we're doing a fall rye and a vetch. That's what's currently in the field that will overwinter. So what we're doing is we're either using the hogs to graze down that cover crop and then reseeding, or we're using tillage to till in and then reseeding. So in the grazing, what we did is we hand spread our subplot, our mixture of cover crop 24 hours before we were going to move the pigs. And that allows them to kind of trample it in, incorporate into the soil. And we did augment that seeding rate a little bit to accommodate for some eating of the seed. And then, as I said, in the tillage, we mechanically turned it over. So what that looks like, so we planted May 18, my apologies, not 15, July 2nd. So this is the whole field. We go in and we divide it all out into grazing strips and tillage strips. And then also those subplots. So this is actually, and it's easy to do because we're using pig fencing because we need that for the pigs. So what we're doing is because it's an electrical line, we need to make sure that there's no actual living material on the line. It will short it and then it doesn't really work as a fence. So we buzz through, put our lines in, and that divides the field up between grazing and tillage. And then we put our pigs into the field. So again, these are the subplots. And so they're 30 by 38 feet. 2 pigs per subplot, and there's 4 strips, so it's a total of 8 hogs. They have mobile housing units, which we move as we move the pigs, as well as barrel waters that we can move as well. You can see here, this is looking at the southeast corner of the field. You can see down, we have our 4, there's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those are our grazing strips that they're going to move this way down the field. These are our pigos, just as a fun. We use almost 100% Berkshire. They did have a little Tamsworth in them, but Berkshire hogs. So as I mentioned, we are spreading that summer cover crop as we move the pigs. And so this is looking at August 17th. This is our buckwheat coming through. You can see a little bit regrowth of that oats and field pea as well. As you know, obviously there's going to be some regrowth, particularly if the hogs don't eat it down really well. And in that first, with the spring summer crop, it was a really full, robust growth. And we had a hard time in one of the strips getting the pigs to really eat it down. It had been like 15 days and we're like, oh, we got to move them. And so there was some regrowth, particularly it was this plot. But what I want to point out is here is our first subplot. Here is the second. And then right there's the third. So you can see the difference in growth of that summer cover crop because it was seeded about 1 week later, 2 weeks later. And so it grew, but then we will move the hogs back and they feed here, there. And so it kind of is a cyclical thing. Here you can see, this is the hogs all the way back in that 6th subplot, and you can see the regrowth of the cover crop. Then finally, we're in the fall cover crop. So this is what the tillage plots looks like. This was September 30 after we've seeded and taken a light disc over it and kind of incorporated in. And then these are the hog plots. Same fall cover crop. It's nice, you can see that actually we have similar cover on both the tillage and the hogs, which is important. And again, you can kind of see that regrowth gradient as we move across the subplots. Okay, we're really looking at soil and how the tillage versus grazing is really impacting the soil. So spring following, so this spring, where the hogs were in this field, we will do intensive soil sampling. We're looking at chemical, physical, and biological characteristics of the soil to compare tillage versus grazing. Because we're showing time, I won't read through them all. They're there for everybody to see. And then the question is, okay, so the following year, the subsequent crops after this tillage, or the cover crop, basically setting aside land that we put into cover crop that a vegetable farmer is now going to put vegetables into, are we seeing differences between grazing and tillage? And so we're using 2 crops, butternut squash and sweet corn. Both, if it is a diversified vegetable farm, they might probably be growing these 2 crops. They're also both direct seeded, so we don't have to compare between a transplant and a direct seed. And it's 2 rows of squash and 6 rows of corn per plot. So through the grazing and through the tillage. And we're looking to see if there's a difference in terms of weed emergence between grazing and tillage, and then also how the actual crop is faring in terms of crop performance and then its subsequent yield. And so right here, you can see we have our 2 squash rows and then our 6 corn. This is a border. Then we have, that would be corn and squash. It's a little weedy here. I think I took this picture and then weeded it. So probably should have done that the other way around, but here we are. It is a farm, so there are weeds. Really quick preliminary results. So I have all of the data now that we've put the farm to bed and we're back inside. I've been organizing and getting it ready to run, but I don't have really concrete data for you yet. Big takeaway is that the hogs fit really well into a small scale intensive production system. My colleague Mike Robinson and I are the 2 that are doing the research, and we are moving the hogs, etc. And we can move a set of hogs from one subplot to the next in 3 minutes, and that includes housing and watering. And so it really can be pretty labor and time saving, which is really cool. And then in the following vegetables, this year we saw a lot of, this is anecdotal, but a lot of visual differences in the corn. Corn's a really great crop to use if we're trying to observe differences in terms of height and color. It really responds to nitrogen specifically, and it's a heavy feeder. And so we could see particularly where we had grazing plots, particularly if we had areas where pigs were defecating, you'd see some kind of big shoot ups. And so it'll be interesting to see if we see any statistical differences between those yields other than just visually. So again, a couple conclusions. The hog rotation system, it could be a really good, within that cover crops, could be a really useful system for a small scale farmer, particularly because you could be using 2 hogs at a time. It will be interesting to see if we see any statistical differences in the soil. Soil is known for changing. It takes a long time for it to change just due to its nature. So it'll be interesting to see if the data shows differences other than anecdotally. And finally, as I said, we see some anecdotal difference in the vegetable production. So with that, I want to say thank you and take any questions.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Leah. As I give people a moment to add in their questions, I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm actually putting my market farm bed into cover crops next year. So I think everybody's finding out that I have a very selfish reason to moderate this session today, because you guys are all just going to teach me how to manage my quarter acre better. We do have one question in here. So did the hogs have any other feed during their rotation, or was it just the grazed area that they had?
Yeah, so we do also, they are given additional feed. We have a mash mix and we're doing about a bucket per 2 hogs. So yeah, so they're grazing, and we would alter that depending on if we wanted them to really eat it down or not. But yeah, the cover crops weren't going to be enough feed without some addition.
Fantastic. And we'll see if we can squeeze in 2 questions because they keep going back in popularity. So we have one question from Jason about have you considered measuring soil aggregate stability, as it's one of the sensitive proxy indicators for soil structure and change?
Yes, that is a good question. We have considered it. Part of the reason why it wasn't on that list is just trying to narrow down the number of soil matrices to ones that, because we're using texture and some other ones that are not quite aggregates, but hopefully to kind of get at that number. So yes, we have thought about it and are just trying to kind of work within our soil sampling ability.
Okay, fantastic. And last question that we have before we move on to our third presentation this morning. How did you prepare the soil before planting the cover crops the next year? Did you need to till or smooth the soil after grazing the pigs through the section?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did till. We do a light till that in that spring to put in. We take our soil measurements, then till to put in our vegetables. So that is something that we would like to look at more moving forward. Is there a way to eliminate any kind of tillage that subsequent vegetable season? So yes, we did prep our fields with some tillage.
Okay, fantastic. So I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but I'll have Leah take a look and maybe be able to type in an answer, keep the conversation going. I know we also have a great use of Padlet, which is going to make sure that we can come back and have this discussion throughout today and moving forward. So thank you, Leah, so much for sharing your research with us this morning.
Thank you.
All right. So for our third presentation, I'm really excited to welcome Raelani Kesler. Raelani is a graduate student pursuing her Master of Science in Soil Science in the Sustainable Agriculture Landscapes Lab at the University of British Columbia. Originally from Washington State, she brings experience working in organic vegetable production to her current research on the efforts of overwintering plastic tarping on soil moisture, available nutrients, and crop yield on the organic vegetable farms in BC. So thanks for joining us today, Raelani.
Yeah, thank you, Serena, for that introduction. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the effects of overwinter plastic tarping on soil moisture, available nutrients, and crop yield on organic vegetable farms in BC. This work is a part of my master's project entitled Too Much Water, Too Little. So to give you kind of an idea of the flow here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context for this project, and then an overview of cover cropping and tarps, move into our objectives and how we designed the project, and then talk a bit about the data and how it compared to our hypotheses. So the impetus for this project is to help organic vegetable growers deal with some of the changes and challenges associated with climate change. And one big change we're expecting in BC is increased shoulder season or spring and fall moisture. So you can see on this graph, which has the historic climate data for Vancouver, the blue bars are precipitation and the red line is temperature. So shoulder season precipitation is expected to increase in these kind of blue shaded rectangles. And when we overlay that with some of our kind of key mechanical farm tasks, we see that we're looking at farmers having to establish, terminate, and plant cover crops during this time of increased precipitation, which is worrisome from a soil health perspective. So the benefits of cover crops are super well established. They can take up nutrients that may have been left in the soil after fertilization that the crops didn't get to. They protect those nutrients from leaching then by holding them in their biomass, protecting waterways. And then they also physically protect the ground from erosion. And we saw that's important because we're getting most of our rain during the off season or the non-production season. They can also help build organic soil organic matter when they get tilled in the spring or incorporated by a hog perhaps. They're going to break down and decompose and add their nutrients to the soil, and they can also improve nutrient cycling just on their own. Some species are nitrogen fixing in and of themselves, and then that added addition of biomass can stimulate microbial activity, contributing to nutrient cycling also. However, all of these benefits don't come without some associated challenges. It's often really difficult for farmers to time the establishment of cover crops, to get them in early enough to get a really good stand. You're often having to forfeit some weeks of harvest and some income that would come along with that. And then in the spring, it can take many weeks for cover crops to decompose. So you're trying to balance optimum nutrient release from the cover crops with your crop plan and precipitation regimes and weed pressure. And cover crops are often associated with pretty intensive tillage, which is part of what Leah was really nicely discussing before this. And so there's that component where you're adding organic matter, but you're also disrupting some of the soil structure. That's really helpful for a great variety of reasons. And there's also some regional challenges associated with these cover crops. So in the interior of BC or up in the mountains, winter can come really quickly, and so the cover crops can be difficult to establish. And in the Fraser Valley, where the climate is more favorable to the establishment, there's a bunch of migratory birds that often eat a lot of the cover crop. So given all of these challenges, their producers are looking for some additional overwintering options. And one such example of this is the use of silage tarps. So the use of these tarps has been increasing on organic vegetable farms in recent years. These are black, non-permeable plastic tarps that are traditionally manufactured for protecting hay crops from spoiling after harvest. And the potential uses for these are many on organic vegetable farms. They can prolong the season. They can be use of a tool for season extension by warming the soil in the spring, helping to keep things dry. They decrease erosion threats by protecting soil from heavy precipitation in the winter months, and they can help decrease reliance on mechanical tillage for field preparation. However, relatively little is known about these tarps with respect to nutrient cycling, moisture regimes, or their effect on biological activity. And additionally, they are plastic or non-renewable resource. And unlike the use of cover crops, they do not implicitly add organic matter to the soil. So the potential use of these tarps are pretty vast, as I was saying. This study in particular only looks at the overwinter cover strategy. So this would be laying these tarps in the winter time, not in combination of cover crop in lieu of cover crop in areas where cover crop couldn't be established, but do in fact have a potential to reduce tillage. Further down in this chart, these are two other possible examples of the uses of these tarps. So they could be laid down in the spring just to kill the cover crop itself, but wouldn't be left down all winter. And then they're also being used in between summer and spring successions to clear weed flushes before the subsequent crop goes in. So the specific objectives of this study are to quantify the effect of overwinter tarping on spring soil moisture, available nitrogen, crop yield, microbial biomass, and enzymatic activity. And today I'll just be discussing the first four of these. Sorry, I forgot to mention electrical conductivity. We snuck that in there also. So I'll be talking about the first four of these and our preliminary results after 1 year of a 2-year study. So with these objectives in mind, we designed a field study incorporating data from 12 regional farms across the province in conjunction with 2 mother farms, which hosted replicated versions of the same experiment. So the tarps were laid out in the fall of 2019, and you can see on the right-hand side here, these are examples of regional farm plots. So they all have 1 tarp plot and 1 untarped plot. We did try and get cover crops established on every farm, but given those challenges enumerated earlier, only about half of them were successful. So we're referring to these plots as untarped. And you can see the geographical spread of these on this map. So there are 3 growing regions. We have Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and the Kootenay Mountains. So the data was collected from here in the spring of 2020. We got soil samples and soil moisture information. And so on the mother farms, where we had 16 tarped and 16 cover cropped plots, we just had 2 of these sites. One was at UBC Farm and the other was at Greenfire Farm on Vancouver Island. And here, in addition to the soil and moisture information collected in the spring, we also got some yield information in the fall, a year after tarping. And then at UBC Farm, we tracked the overwinter soil moisture every couple weeks at a depth of 0 to 3 inches. And so that's what we're looking at here first. You can see the green dots here are the averaged soil moisture values from our cover cropped plots, and then the gray are the average values from the tarped plots. The dashed lines are the dates of tarp installation and tarp removal, and this blue line is the planting date. And so if we follow, along the y-axis here is volumetric water content. So that's how much soil moisture. And then we have the dates ranging from November of 2019 through May of 2020. And so we can see that when we put the tarps on here, the soil moisture was at about the same level. And then throughout the winter, the tarp plots remained drier until about early March, when we see these lines cross, and then the tarp plots are wetter until we remove the tarps themselves, and by the time planting comes around about 3 weeks later, soil moisture is pretty much in the same, is really comparable between the plots. And we think that as the soil temperature warmed up in the spring, those tarps prevented any sort of evaporation, and so they stayed much more humid under there while the cover cropped plots were able to dry out. And this helps us make sense of the data that we collected from our regional farms. So this is a box plot, and this is how the rest of my data is going to be presented. So I'm just going to take a moment to make sure we're all looking at the same thing. So box plots are show the distribution of the data. So within these colored boxes are the middle 50% of the data. The black lines are the median and the black dots are the mean. Anytime I found statistical significance in a difference between the treatments, there's an asterisk with an associated p-value. The untarped or the cover cropped plots are always going to be green, and the tarped plots are gray. So here we also have volumetric water content along the y-axis, and then we have our 2 treatments, tarped and untarped. And all of this data is aggregated from all of the regional farms. And here we see that at the time of tarp removal in the spring of 2020, which would have been on average early to mid-April, the water content is much higher in the tarped plots than untarped plots. So from this graph, like that would be kind of here-ish, which is a really similar trend. So if we were aiming to have some of these plots maybe be drier, this is letting us know that last year we definitely took them off too late on the regional farms. So the next thing that we looked at was soil nitrate, and nitrate is a really mobile and leachable form of nitrogen. It's also very plant available. And so we were interested to see if the tarps were able to hold some of that nitrate that might be washed away in heavy winter rains. And so on the mother farms at UBC and Greenfire, we did see in both cases significantly more nitrate, which is along our y-axis here, in the tarped plots compared to our untarped cover cropped plots. And we saw the same trend on our regional farms. So even though not all of these farms had a cover crop, we still saw higher levels of nitrate underneath the tarps in the spring when we went to pull them off. So after seeing that trend in the nitrate data, we were curious about electrical conductivity, which is a measure of the salts in the soil solution or the salinity of the soil. And a lot of those salts are plant available nutrients that could be useful for an establishing crop in the spring, but levels that are too high, salt levels that are too high, are also detrimental for growth. And so what we saw here was really similar to the trend in the nitrate, where there's much higher levels of electrical conductivity in the tarped plots compared to the cover cropped plots. However, none of these measured high enough to be at a dangerous or detrimental level of EC. And we saw the exact same thing in our aggregated regional farm data. So at the time of tarp removal, when we took these soil samples, electrical conductivity was significantly higher in the tarped plots compared to the untarped plots. And so on the mother farms, we were also able to get a yield sample, and each of the farms grew 3 different crops, fennel, golden beets, and red beets, but they grew each crop in every plot. So there was 1 bed of each in every plot. And then you can see here, we have the marketable yield on the y-axis, and then we have all of our different crops on the x-axis, and then the graph on the left is UBC, on the right is green fire. And so while there was definitely a difference in yield between the different types of crops, we didn't see any sort of difference in yield that related to our treatment of winter cover. So to kind of sum up the data that we just looked at, we were hoping and expecting that the spring soil moisture at the time of tarp removal would be lower underneath these tarps by reducing infiltration, maybe keeping that ground a little bit drier to be more workable in the spring, or to allow farmers to get into that ground a bit earlier. And that's not what we saw on the regional farms when the tarps were taken off in kind of early to mid-April. But we did see with our data from UBC Farm that over the winter, the ground was drier underneath the tarps, but there's some more management kind of important information about when exactly those tarps could come off to optimize soil moisture in the spring. We also did find that both available nitrate and electrical conductivity was higher in the spring at the time of tarp removal. And we didn't see any effect on crop yield. So there's a lot of people responsible for the successes we've had so far in this project. Really big thank you to all participating farmers. You've been really generous with your time and space, especially since all of this data collection happened amidst the pandemic. Also, big thank you to the project supervisors, regional collaborators, committee members, and everyone else who's had a hand in this. And this project is a part of the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program funded by the Climate Action Initiative. So, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Raelani. I've learned a lot. I've taken a lot of notes, and a lot of the questions you asked during this project, I've actually come up quite a bit in the with my work in the caribou. So I think I'll be reconnecting to make sure we can share this to the producers there as well. So we do have a bunch of questions coming in, and we'll go by most thumbs up. So we have a question from Dieter about the plastic. So what would the long-term waste disposal plan be for the plastics?
Yeah, so this is something that has come up a lot in our interactions with the farmers that are already using these types of plastics. It's like we already rely so heavily as organic producers on these plastics. It's in our drip tape, it's in anything we're using for greenhouses or season extension, and there needs to, in general, be a way to deal with all of these agricultural plastics. So I don't we're not looking at that specifically as to how one would deal with that. This is more kind of what's another way that we can help manage the soil over the winter when cover crops can't be established, which we all feel like is probably the best way to go if you can for from a soil health perspective. But it is definitely a concern, is how do you deal with these plastics when they have too many holes and can't be used anymore, and really how long will that be? How long will they last? And yeah, so I don't have a good answer for you, but it is definitely a concern of a lot of people that are using them.
Yeah, it is a big question mark, and maybe as an informal reference, I've used the same, so I reused silage wrap that actually did come off some bales, and it's been 5 seasons strong, and the plastic is still working, and that's for the same crop year after year, but hopefully there could be some longish term use of those plastics instead of having to be disposed right away.
Yeah, I know the manufacturer says that they last 10 years is their official kind of claim. And then the producers in our study that have been using these plastics for the longest have had them for 5 or 6 years. So it's our on the ground intel.
Similar experiences. That's great.
Yeah.
So the next question that has the most votes we have is from Drew. So it says, Raelani, what timing do you think might be more ideal for removing the tarps to achieve the reduced soil water content through tarping? And would that be based on tracking spring precipitation or some other environmental factor in order to optimize that timing?
Yeah, I think that definitely tracking precipitation would be a key to that. Soil texture is going to be another really big factor in when to pull off that tarp, and then also the temperature. So I think one way that people are using these tarps that I feel like has a lot of potential is if you are going to use them to cover the ground over the winter, also using them kind of as a weed management tool where in the early spring, maybe when the sun starts to come out before the January that we heard about, you would peel back that tarp, allow some of the weeds to germinate under there, allow the soil some time to dry out, and then put the tarp back on and kill that flush of weeds, and then keep it dry from any other rain that comes down. And so it would be maybe more of like a trial and error in a site-specific area, to be like taking your own soil moisture measurements or gauges, however you do that, based on kind of how warm it is, how many weeds you want to flush, and how much water's come down.
Yeah, definitely a lot of moving components. And perhaps for our last question, because you mentioned the different types of soils and how that could be impacted, we did have a question about what were the types of soils that where you did this experiment, and specifically it sounds like they're interested in any experience using these in heavy clay soils.
Yeah, so it was a really wide variety of soils. So Leah is actually a participant in this project, and as she mentioned, the KPU soil is a really fine textured heavy soil. A few of the other farms in Delta also were in a similar situation, and then it ranged all the way from some pretty sandy soils out on the island to more of like a mixed variety out in the Kootenays. However, like both at UBC and at Greenfire, neither of those were particularly heavy soils, and that's where we have like the replicated data from that might be more informative to one soil type in particular. And so I don't know that I can really speak to that from this particular data set, just because our heavy clay soils were few and far between.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and so, but it sounds like people in those situations with heavier clay soils are still utilizing this as a tool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that no two farms were using them in exactly the same way, and many of them weren't using them in this way that we had described, but were using them for other purposes, is either a weed control tool or a labor reduction tool, or as a reduced tillage tool.
Well, thank you. And I know, again, we didn't get to all of the questions. They're still coming in. So as I do the final comments, I'm sure we'll be able to address them. But thank you, Raelani, for sharing the research that you're doing. You're obviously, the work you're doing is answering a lot of questions for people.